The trading station orbited a dying star, its metal hull scarred by countless meteor impacts and solar flares. Captain Sarah Chen stepped off her cargo ship, the Defiant, and into the dimly lit docking bay. The air tasted metallic, recycled too many times through filters that had seen better decades. Around her, alien traders of every conceivable shape and size conducted their business with hushed voices and suspicious glances. Sarah had been trading in the Outer Rim for 5 years now, ever since Earth had made first contact with the Galactic Commerce Union. Humans were still the new kids on the block, viewed with a mixture of curiosity and disdain by species that had been traveling the stars for millennia. Most aliens saw humans as primitive upstarts who had barely crawled out of their gravity well. She made her way through the crowded marketplace, her boots echoing on the grated floor. Vendors hawked exotic goods from 1,000 worlds, crystalline memory cores that stored entire civilizations' worth of data, bioluminescent plants that could survive in hard vacuum, and weapons that could slice through starship armor like paper. Sarah's cargo hold was filled with earth goods, coffee, chocolate, and various spices that had surprisingly become luxury items among certain alien species. As she approached the central trading hub, a commotion caught her attention. A crowd had gathered around what appeared to be some kind of confrontation. Sarah pushed through the throng of curious onlookers, her hand instinctively moving to the plasma pistol at her hip. In the center of the circle stood a young human male, probably in his early 20s, with sandy hair and the lean build of someone who had grown up on a low-gravity world. He faced off against a towering alien that Sarah recognized as a Kralith, one of the warrior species from the Andromeda Spiral. The Kralith stood nearly 8 feet tall, its chitinous exoskeleton gleaming under the station's harsh lighting. Forearms ending in razor-sharp claws extended from its torso, and its mandibles clicked menacingly as it spoke. "You dare to refuse my offer, human whelp?" The Kralith hissed, its translator rendering the alien words into heavily accented standard. "Do you not understand what I am? I am Warlord Thektar of the Crimson Nebula Fleet. I have conquered 17 star systems and enslaved entire species." The young human stood his ground, seemingly unimpressed by the alien's impressive credentials. Sarah noticed his hands were steady, his breathing calm. Either he was incredibly brave or incredibly stupid. Given what she knew about humans, it was probably both. "I understand perfectly what you are," the human replied, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent marketplace. "But understanding doesn't equal fear. You want to buy my cargo of rare earth minerals at half their market value." I said no. That's business, not a declaration of war. Thektar's mandibles spread wide in what Sarah assumed was the Kralith equivalent of a threatening grin. "Perhaps you need a demonstration of why my terms are not negotiable." The warlord raised one of his forearms and made a complex gesture. "Behold my pet, human. It has killed more sentients than you have years in your pathetic lifespan." A section of the crowd scrambled backward as something massive moved in the shadows behind Thektar. Sarah felt her breath catch as the creature emerged into the light. It was unlike anything she had ever seen, even in the xenobiology texts she had studied. The beast stood on 6 powerful legs, each ending in claws that could easily tear through steel plating. Its hide was covered in overlapping scales that seemed to shift color depending on the angle of the light. Most disturbing were its eyes, dozens of them arranged in clusters around what might have been its head, each one focusing independently on different targets. "A void stalker," someone in the crowd whispered. Sarah had heard stories about these creatures, apex predators from the dark spaces between stars, nearly impossible to kill and absolutely impossible to tame. Yet here one stood apparently docile, awaiting its master's command. The young human looked at the creature for a long moment, studying it with the same calm attention he might give to an interesting piece of machinery. The crowd held its collective breath, waiting for him to either flee in terror or collapse in fear. Instead, he did something completely unexpected. He smiled. "That's quite a pet you have there," the human said, taking a step closer to the void stalker. "What do you feed it?" Thektar's mandibles clicked in confusion. This was clearly not the reaction he had expected. "Feed it? It feeds on terror, human. It feeds on the fear of those who dare to oppose me, and right now it smells your fear." "Actually," the human said, taking another step forward, "I don't think it does." He looked directly at the creature, making eye contact with several of its independently moving eyes. "You know what I think? I think your pet isn't as tame as you pretend. I think you're just as afraid of it as everyone else, but you found a way to convince it not to eat you. For now. The Void Stalker's head tilted, a gesture that was almost bird-like despite its size. Several of its eyes remained focused on the human while others swiveled to look at Thektar. For the first time since the confrontation began, the Kralith warlord looked uncertain. You speak nonsense, human, Thektar said, but there was a note of doubt in his voice. The creature obeys me absolutely. It would never what? The human interrupted. Would never realize that you're not actually its master. Just another potential meal that happens to know which buttons to push? These things are intelligent, aren't they? Probably more intelligent than either of us. Sarah watched in fascination as the dynamic in the circle began to shift. The human's calm confidence was infectious, while Thektar's bluster was starting to sound hollow. More importantly, the Void Stalker was becoming increasingly agitated, its scales shifting through patterns of color that Sarah's neural implant identified as signs of predatory interest. Enough, Thektar roared. You will learn to fear me, human. Creature, show this fool what happens to those who defy me. The warlord pointed at the young human, expecting his pet to leap forward and tear the upstart apart. Instead, the Void Stalker turned its massive head and looked at Thektar with what could only be described as hunger. The silence stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Every being in the marketplace held their breath as the Void Stalker slowly turned its attention from the human to its supposed master. Thektar's confident posture began to crumble as he realized his creature was no longer looking at him with the usual indifference, but with something far more dangerous, calculation. Creature, I command you to, Thektar began, but his words died as the Void Stalker took a step toward him instead of the human. The young human seemed completely unfazed by the fact that he was standing mere feet from one of the galaxy's most feared predators. Instead, he appeared to be studying the interaction between the Kralith and his pet with scientific curiosity. You know, the human said conversationally, as if discussing the weather rather than standing in the middle of a potentially deadly situation. I've been reading about Void Stalkers during my journey here. Fascinating creatures. Did you know they're actually pack hunters in their natural environment? They have complex social hierarchies based on intelligence and strength. Thektar's 4 eyes swiveled to focus on the human, confusion replacing his earlier confidence. What are you talking about, human? This creature is mine. I found it as a hatchling and raised it to obey my every command. Oh, I don't doubt that you raised it, the human replied, taking a casual step closer to the creature. But I think you might have misunderstood something fundamental about the relationship. See, Void Stalkers don't really do obedience the way other species might. They're too smart for that. They do, however, understand mutual benefit and respect. The creature's many eyes were now tracking the conversation, its head swiveling between the two speakers like a spectator at a tennis match. Sarah noticed that several of its eyes remained fixed on Thektar, while others focused on the human. The difference in its attention was subtle but unmistakable. The eyes watching the human held curiosity, while those watching the Kralith held something much more predatory. You're wrong. Thektar snarled, but his voice cracked slightly. I am its master. It fears me. The human laughed, a sound so genuine and relaxed that it sent ripples of confusion through the crowd. Fear? No, I don't think it fears you at all. I think it's been playing along because the arrangement was convenient. You provide it with food and targets, and it provides you with an impressive reputation. But that only works as long as you're useful to it. As if to emphasize the human's point, the Void Stalker took another step toward Thektar, the Kralith warrior, who had moments before been the picture of confident dominance, now backed away from his own creature. But here's the interesting part. The human continued, seemingly oblivious to the rising tension. You've been using it wrong. You've been treating it like a weapon instead of a partner. That's why it's looking at you like its next meal. Sarah found herself leaning forward, caught up in the human's analysis despite the danger. Around her, other traders were beginning to murmur among themselves. Some were placing bets on whether the human would survive the next few minutes, while others were quietly positioning themselves for a quick escape. You speak as if you understand these creatures, Thektar said, his voice now noticeably higher in pitch. But you are just a human. Your species has barely left your homeworld. What could you possibly know about? I know that intelligence recognizes intelligence, the human interrupted. And I know that true predators don't need to be controlled. They need to be respected. He turned to face the Void Stalker directly, making eye contact with several of its independently moving eyes. "Hello there, big guy. You're magnificent, aren't you?" The creature's scales rippled through a pattern of colors that Sarah's implant identified as curiosity, mixed with wariness. It lowered its massive head slightly, studying the human with increased interest. "What are you doing?" Thektar hissed, his mandibles clicking nervously. "Stay away from my creature." "Your creature?" The human raised an eyebrow. "I don't think it sees itself as belonging to anyone, do you?" This last question was directed at the Void Stalker, and impossibly the creature seemed to understand. Its head tilted in what looked almost like a nod. The crowd gasped. Several aliens near the back began edging toward the exits, clearly uncomfortable with the way the situation was developing. Sarah noticed that even the station's security forces, who had been watching from the periphery, were looking increasingly nervous. "This is impossible," Thektar muttered. "It doesn't respond to anyone but me. I am its master." "No," the human said firmly. "You're its meal ticket." "There's a difference." He took another step closer to the creature, close enough now that it could have struck him down with a single swipe of its massive claws. Instead, it watched him with what could only be described as interest. "Tell me something," the human continued, his voice taking on a conversational tone as if he were chatting with an old friend, rather than addressing a creature that could tear him apart in seconds. "How long have you been stuck with this arrangement? Following orders, being treated like a pet instead of the intelligent being you obviously are?" The Void Stalker's response was immediate and unmistakable. A low rumble emerged from deep in its chest, a sound that made the metal grating beneath their feet vibrate. Sarah's translation implant worked frantically to process the sound, finally settling on something approximating frustrated agreement. "You can understand me, can't you?" the human said, his voice filled with genuine wonder. "I thought so. You're probably more intelligent than most of the beings on this station, including him." He jerked his thumb toward Thektar, who was now visibly sweating despite the cool air of the trading post. The creature's rumble deepened, and this time Sarah's implant translated it as something approaching amusement. The Void Stalker was laughing. "This cannot be happening," Thektar said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Creature, I command you to kill this human, now." For a moment, the massive predator turned to look at the Kralith warlord. Then, in a gesture that sent shock waves through the assembled crowd, it shook its head in an unmistakably negative response. The marketplace erupted in chaos. Aliens who had been watching the confrontation with morbid curiosity suddenly found themselves scrambling for cover as the implications of what they had just witnessed sank in. A Void Stalker had just refused a direct command from its supposed master. Worse yet, it had done so in favor of a human, a member of the youngest and supposedly weakest species in the galactic community. Thektar stood frozen, his forearms trembling as he stared at his creature in disbelief. The power dynamic that had defined his relationship with the Void Stalker for years had just crumbled in the space of a few minutes, and everyone present had witnessed it. "Impossible," he whispered, his translator barely catching the words. "You are mine. I raised you. I fed you. I made you what you are." The Void Stalker turned its massive head toward its former master, and Sarah could see something that chilled her to the bone. The creature's expression, alien as it was, clearly conveyed contempt. It made a sound that was part growl, part rumble, and Sarah's implant struggled to translate it before settling on something that roughly meant foolish inferior. The human, meanwhile, seemed completely at ease despite being at the center of what could potentially become a bloodbath. He continued his calm conversation with the creature as if they were old friends meeting for coffee. "I imagine it gets pretty boring, doesn't it?" he said to the Void Stalker, following the same predictable pattern over and over. Intimidate, threaten, kill on command. No real challenge, no intellectual stimulation. You're capable of so much more than that. The creature's scales shifted through a complex pattern of colors, and this time, Sarah's implant managed a more sophisticated translation. The Void Stalker was expressing something close to grateful acknowledgement. It was agreeing with the human's assessment of its situation. "This is madness," Thektar shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "You are nothing but a primitive human. Your species hasn't even mastered faster-than-light travel properly. What could you possibly offer that I cannot?" The human turned to look at the Kralith with an expression of mild surprise, as if he had forgotten the alien was there. "Oh, I'm not offering anything," he said. "I'm just having a conversation. See, that's the difference between us. You've been treating our friend here like a tool, a weapon to wave around when you want to intimidate people. But I can see what you missed. This is a sentient being with its own thoughts, desires, and frustrations. He turned back to the Void Stalker, which had lowered itself closer to his level, bringing its cluster of eyes down to approximate human height. You've been waiting for someone to recognize that, haven't you? Someone to see you as more than just a monster? The creature's response was immediate and profound. It made a series of sounds that Sarah's implant translated as complex emotional concepts: loneliness, frustration, hope, and something that might have been gratitude. The Void Stalker was having a conversation, and it was telling the human that he was the first being in years to treat it as an equal rather than a tool. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the human reached out slowly, telegraphing his movements clearly, and gently touched one of the creature's massive claws. The Void Stalker didn't flinch or react aggressively. Instead, it made a soft rumbling sound that Sarah's implant identified as contentment. "There we go," the human said softly. "You're not a monster at all, are you? You're just tired of being treated like one." Thektar's mandibles clicked frantically as he watched his carefully constructed reputation crumble before his eyes. "You cannot do this," he screeched. "That creature is bound to me. I have the neural control implants. I have the behavioral conditioning." "Oh, you mean these implants?" the human asked, pulling out a small device that Sarah recognized as a neural disruptor. "The ones that have been slowly failing for months now? Yes, I noticed the microfractures in the control signals. Your pet has been free for quite some time now. It just didn't see any reason to let you know." The Kralith's eyes went wide as he realized the implications. If the control implants had been failing, then the creature had been choosing to obey his commands rather than being compelled to do so. And if it had been choosing to obey, then it could just as easily choose to stop. "How did you?" Thektar began, but the human waved him off. "Basic neural engineering," he said dismissively. Any first-year student at Earth's Xenobiology Academy could have spotted the degradation patterns. The fact that you didn't notice suggests you've been relying on fear and intimidation rather than actually understanding your companion here. The Void Stalker rumbled again, and this time the sound was unmistakably amused. It was enjoying watching its former master's discomfort. More than that, it seemed to be developing a genuine appreciation for the human who had bothered to understand its situation. "But this changes everything," Thektar said, his voice rising to nearly a shriek. "If the creature is not bound to me, if it chooses its own actions, then I am." He trailed off as the full weight of his predicament hit him. "Vulnerable," the human finished helpfully. "Yes, I imagine that would be quite a shock. You've built your entire reputation on having an untamable creature at your beck and call. What happens to that reputation when everyone realizes the creature was only playing along because it was convenient?" Around the marketplace, Sarah could see other aliens beginning to reassess their opinions of the fearsome Kralith warlord. Whispered conversations were breaking out as traders and merchants realized that Thektar's power had been largely illusory. Without his creature to back up his threats, he was just another bully with delusions of grandeur. The Void Stalker, meanwhile, was studying the human with increasing interest. It made a series of complex sounds that Sarah's implant struggled to translate before settling on what appeared to be a question. The creature was asking something about the human's intentions. "What do I want?" the human repeated, apparently understanding the creature's inquiry. "Nothing from you. I was just curious about the dynamic here. It seemed obvious that you were intelligent, and I wondered if anyone had ever bothered to have an actual conversation with you, rather than just barking orders." The creature's response was immediate and emphatic. The rumbling sound it made translated roughly to "never before," but with emotional overtones that suggested deep loneliness and frustration. The Void Stalker had been isolated not just physically, but intellectually and emotionally as well. "Well," the human said with a gentle smile, "would you like to continue our conversation somewhere more private? I suspect our friend here is going to have some explaining to do to his business associates." The Void Stalker's response to the human's invitation was immediate and decisive. It rose to its full height, towering over the assembled crowd, and took several steps away from Thektar. The symbolism was unmistakable. The creature was choosing its own path for the first time in years, and that path led away from its former captor. "No!" Thektar screamed, his composure finally shattering completely. "You cannot leave me. I made you. I own you. Without me, you are nothing." The Void Stalker turned to look at the Kralith one last time, and the sound it made was unlike anything Sarah had heard before. Her implant worked frantically to process the complex vocalizations before finally settling on a translation that made her blood run cold. "I was never yours to own." The creature's words, filtered through the translation system, carried a weight of dignity and self-determination that sent ripples of shock through the crowd. Many of the aliens present had never considered that such creatures might have complex emotional lives and personal agency. The realization was forcing them to reconsider everything they thought they knew about the relationship between intelligence and physical power. "This is extraordinary," whispered a Centaurian trader standing near Sarah. "I've never seen anything like it. The creature is asserting its independence. It's choosing to ally itself with the human rather than submit to the Kralith." The human seemed oblivious to the historical significance of what was happening. He simply nodded to the Void Stalker as if confirming plans for lunch and began walking toward the exit of the trading area. The massive creature followed, its 6 legs moving with surprising grace for something so large. As they passed through the crowd, aliens pressed themselves against the walls to make room. But Sarah noticed something interesting. They weren't fleeing in terror as they had before. Instead, they watched with fascination and even respect. The Void Stalker's behavior had changed completely. No longer was it the menacing weapon that Thektar had wielded like a club. Now it moved with purpose and dignity, keeping pace with its chosen companion rather than lurking behind a master. "Wait," Thektar called out desperately. "You don't understand what you're doing, human. That creature is dangerous. It has killed hundreds of beings. It will turn on you the moment it grows bored." The human paused and turned back to face the Kralith. His expression was patient but firm. "You know, that's exactly the kind of thinking that got you into this situation in the first place," he said. "You never tried to understand your companion as an individual. You just assumed that because it was physically powerful, it must be inherently violent and uncontrollable." The Void Stalker rumbled something that Sarah's implant translated as agreement tinged with sadness. The creature was acknowledging the violence in its past while also expressing regret about it. "Yes," the human said, apparently understanding the creature's complex communication. "I imagine you did what you felt you had to do to survive, but that doesn't define who you are now or who you could become given the chance to choose for yourself." This exchange sent another wave of murmurs through the crowd. The human wasn't just communicating with the Void Stalker. He was validating its feelings and treating its past actions with understanding rather than judgment. It was a level of empathy that few beings would show to such a feared creature. Thektar's mandibles clicked frantically as he realized he was losing not just his creature, but his entire power base. "This is madness," he shrieked. "The Galactic Commerce Union will never allow this. A human cannot simply steal a registered companion creature." "Steal?" The human raised an eyebrow. "I'm not stealing anything. I'm simply having a conversation with a sentient being who has chosen to walk in the same direction as me. Unless, of course, you have some legal documentation proving ownership of a sapient individual." The question hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah watched as Thektar's face cycled through several colors, indicating extreme agitation. The truth was that most companion creatures existed in a legal gray area. They were too intelligent to be classified as simple animals, but the galactic legal system had never fully addressed their rights as individuals. "The creature was given to me as compensation for a debt," Thektar said, but his voice lacked conviction. "It is legally mine according to Kralith law." "Kralith law," the human repeated thoughtfully. "But we're not in Kralith space, are we? We're on a neutral trading station governed by Commerce Union regulations, and those regulations specifically prohibit the ownership of sapient beings." He turned to address the crowd. "I believe that was established in the Dignity Accords of 2387, wasn't it?" Several aliens in the crowd nodded, and Sarah could see understanding dawning on their faces. The human had just exposed a fundamental flaw in Thektar's position. If the Void Stalker was intelligent enough to make its own choices, which it had just demonstrated beyond any doubt, then it couldn't legally be owned by anyone. The station's security chief, a massive Thulorian with cybernetic implants covering half his face, stepped forward from where he had been observing the situation. "The human is correct," he rumbled in his species' distinctive bass voice. "Commerce Union law is clear on this matter. Sapient beings cannot be held as property, regardless of how they were originally acquired." Thektar's 4 arms spread wide in a gesture of desperate appeal. "But without the creature, I have nothing. My reputation, my business contracts, my standing in the warrior clans, everything depends on the fear it inspires." "Then perhaps," the human said gently, "it's time to build a reputation based on something more substantial than fear." He looked around at the assembled crowd. The galaxy is full of opportunities for those willing to work for them honestly. The Voidstalker made another sound, this one clearly directed at Thektar. Sarah's implant translated it as something approximating forgiveness mixed with firm dismissal. The creature was acknowledging their shared past while making it clear that their relationship was over. With that final statement, the Voidstalker turned and continued walking toward the exit. The human fell into step beside it, and Sarah found herself following along with a growing crowd of curious onlookers. She wanted to see how this unprecedented situation would develop. As they walked through the station's corridors, Sarah noticed that other beings they encountered reacted very differently to the Voidstalker now. Instead of fleeing in terror, they watched with curiosity and respect. The creature's entire demeanor had changed. It no longer skulked and menaced. Instead, it moved with confidence and purpose, its head held high and its many eyes taking in the sights around it with obvious interest. "Where are we going?" Sarah found herself asking as they approached the docking bay where her ship was berthed. The human turned to her with a surprised smile. "Oh, I didn't realize we had picked up an entourage. I was just planning to show my new friend around the station. I thought it might enjoy seeing some of the areas that weren't usually accessible to it." The Voidstalker rumbled something that sounded like curiosity, and the human nodded in response. "Yes, I imagine you've been restricted to the trading areas and combat arenas. There's so much more to see. Observation decks with views of the dying star, research laboratories, cultural exchange centers. A mind like yours should have access to all of it." As their impromptu tour group made its way through the station, something remarkable began to happen. Word of the confrontation in the marketplace spread like wildfire through the trading post's communication networks. Beings who had heard the story secondhand began emerging from their quarters and shops to catch a glimpse of the human, who had somehow befriended a Voidstalker. But what they saw challenged every assumption they had about both species. The human walked beside the massive predator as an equal, engaging in what appeared to be an ongoing conversation despite the obvious communication barriers. The Voidstalker, for its part, displayed a level of curiosity and engagement that no one had ever witnessed before. It examined everything they passed with obvious interest, its many eyes tracking details that would have escaped notice by most beings. "Look at that," whispered a Dalarian botanist as they passed her atmospheric garden. "It's studying the plant life. I've never seen a Voidstalker show interest in anything that wasn't potential prey." The human overheard her comment and paused. "Would you mind if we took a closer look?" he asked. "I think our friend here has probably been exposed to very limited environments. Natural ecosystems might be fascinating to someone who spent most of their life in sterile ship corridors and combat arenas." The botanist hesitated for a moment, clearly torn between scientific curiosity and natural caution, but the Voidstalker's obvious interest in her garden seemed to win out. "Of course," she said, opening the entrance to her specialized environmental zone. "But please be careful. Some of these plants are extremely rare specimens. What happened next would be talked about in xenobiology circles for years to come." The Voidstalker entered the garden space with extraordinary care, its massive form moving with delicate precision to avoid damaging any of the delicate flora. It approached each plant grouping methodically, studying the different species with intense focus. "It's analyzing them," the botanist breathed in amazement. "Look at the way it's examining the root structures, the leaf patterns, the symbiotic relationships. This creature understands botanical science." The human nodded as if this discovery wasn't surprising at all. "Intelligence is intelligence," he said simply. "Just because someone is built for physical power doesn't mean they can't appreciate complex systems and natural beauty. Our friend here has probably been absorbing information about every environment it's encountered. It just never had anyone to share those observations with. The Void Stalker made a series of complex sounds while examining a particularly intricate flowering vine. The botanist's eyes widened as her translation system processed the vocalizations. "It's asking about the pollination cycle," she said in wonder. "It wants to know how the reproductive process works in low-gravity environments. These are graduate-level questions in xenobotany." Sarah watched the interaction with growing amazement. The feared creature that had terrorized traders and warriors across the galaxy was engaging in sophisticated scientific discourse about plant biology. It was a revelation that forced her to reconsider everything she thought she knew about intelligence and its various manifestations. As they continued their tour, more station residents began joining their group. A Zephyrian physicist engaged the Void Stalker in a discussion about stellar mechanics that left both beings obviously energized. A Centaurian artist showed the creature her holographic sculptures, and was delighted when it began asking questions about the relationship between mathematical concepts and aesthetic beauty. "This is unprecedented," murmured Dr. Veltar, the station's chief xenopsychologist, who had joined the group at the research level. "I've been studying interspecies psychology for 3 decades, and I've never seen anything like this. The creature is displaying cognitive abilities that rival our most advanced species." The human shrugged as if this wasn't particularly surprising. "Maybe the problem wasn't the creature's capacity for learning," he suggested. "Maybe the problem was that no one ever treated it like it was capable of learning." This comment sparked intense discussion among the academics who had gathered around them. The implications were staggering. How many other species had been dismissed as purely instinctual or violent, simply because no one had bothered to engage with them as equals? As they reached the station's observation deck, with its panoramic view of the dying star around which they orbited, the Void Stalker stopped and made a sound that Sarah's implant couldn't translate. The vocalization was too complex, too layered with emotional nuance for the technology to process. "What did it say?" asked Dr. Veltar. The human was quiet for a long moment, watching as the creature stood transfixed by the cosmic vista before them. "I think," he said slowly, "it said beautiful. But that's not quite right either. It's more like beautiful and terrible and meaningful all at once. There isn't really a good translation for the concept." The gathered beings stood in respectful silence as the Void Stalker contemplated the stellar phenomenon. Sarah found herself moved by the sight. This powerful creature feared throughout the galaxy, standing in obvious awe of the natural universe around it. It was a reminder that intelligence could take forms that were radically different from anything they had encountered before. "You know," said Captain Morvex, an elderly Rigelian trader who had been quietly observing the interactions, "I've been traveling the trade routes for over 50 years. I've seen civilizations rise and fall, witnessed first contact between dozens of species, watched the galaxy change in ways I never could have imagined. But this is something entirely new." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked. The old captain gestured toward the human and the Void Stalker, who were now engaged in what appeared to be a philosophical discussion about the nature of stellar death and rebirth. "I mean that we're witnessing the birth of a new kind of diplomacy. Not between governments or species, but between individuals who refuse to be limited by the assumptions others make about them." As if to emphasize his point, the Void Stalker turned from the observation window and made a series of sounds directed at the assembled group. The translation was complex, but the meaning was clear. It was thanking them for treating it as a thinking being rather than a monster. "The pleasure has been entirely ours," Dr. Veltar responded formally. "I hope this is the beginning of many such exchanges." The human smiled and looked around at the diverse group of beings who had gathered to witness this unprecedented interaction. "I have a feeling," he said, "that this is just the beginning. Once word spreads about what happened here today, I suspect a lot of beings are going to start questioning their assumptions about intelligence, communication, and what it means to be truly civilized." Sarah nodded, understanding the broader implications of what she had witnessed. The confrontation that had started as a simple business dispute had evolved into something that could potentially reshape how different species interacted throughout the galaxy. And at the center of it all was a young human who had seen past the surface appearances to recognize the intelligence and dignity of a being that everyone else had written off as nothing more than a weapon. News of the incident spread throughout the galactic communication networks, with the speed that only truly revolutionary events could achieve. Within hours, the story had reached the farthest corners of known space, sparking debates in academic institutions, government chambers, and trading posts from the core worlds to the outer rim. The footage captured by dozens of recording devices on the trading station became the most analyzed piece of media in galactic history. Xenopsychologists dissected every frame, looking for clues about the cognitive capabilities they had overlooked in countless other species. Philosophers debated the implications for consciousness and personhood. Even military strategists found themselves reconsidering long-held assumptions about the nature of power and intimidation. But while the galaxy buzzed with theoretical discussions, something more immediate was happening aboard the trading station. The human, who had introduced himself simply as Marcus Webb, a mining engineer from the Epsilon Eridani colony, found himself at the center of an impromptu revolution in interspecies relations. We've had 17 different research institutions request permission to establish permanent observation posts here, reported Station Administrator Kellix, a bureaucratic Thulorian who seemed overwhelmed by the sudden attention. The Galactic Academy wants to send their entire Department of Comparative Consciousness. The Philosophical Institute of Rigel is offering to fund a complete upgrade of our facilities in exchange for research access. Marcus looked up from where he was sharing a meal with his new companion in the station's main dining area. The Void Stalker had initially drawn stares and nervous whispers from other diners, but those had quickly given way to fascination as beings observed its careful table, manners and obvious engagement with the food as a sensory experience rather than mere sustenance. That's not really up to me, Marcus said mildly. I'm just a guy who was trying to buy some rare earth minerals for my mining operation. This, he gestured toward the Void Stalker, just happened because nobody bothered to have a conversation before making assumptions. The creature rumbled something that Marcus had learned to recognize as amusement. Over the past few hours, their communication had evolved from basic gesture and tone recognition to something approaching genuine linguistic exchange. The Void Stalker, it turned out, was a remarkably quick study when it came to learning new forms of expression. But don't you understand what you've accomplished? Pressed Dr. Veltar, who had attached herself to their group with the determination of a true academic, scenting a career-defining discovery. You've fundamentally altered our understanding of intelligence and consciousness in the galaxy. The implications are staggering. Marcus shrugged. I noticed that a smart creature was being treated like a dumb animal, and I decided to treat it like the intelligent being it obviously was. Seems pretty straightforward to me. This casual dismissal of what the academic community was hailing as a breakthrough seemed to frustrate Dr. Veltar, but Sarah found it refreshing. She had spent the last few hours observing Marcus and his companion, and what struck her most was the human's complete lack of pretension about the situation. He wasn't trying to be a revolutionary or a visionary. He was just being decent to another thinking being. The real question, said Captain Morvex, settling his aging bulk into a chair designed for much smaller beings, is what happens next. Word is already spreading that Thektar has lost control of his creature. Half the warrior clans in the Andromeda Spiral are reassessing their power structures. Some of his business partners are demanding refunds for protection services that apparently aren't going to be provided. The Void Stalker made a sound that might have been satisfaction mixed with regret. It seemed to understand the broader consequences of its decision to assert independence. And while it didn't regret the choice, it apparently felt some sympathy for the chaos it had caused. Change is rarely comfortable for those who benefited from the old system, Marcus observed, but that doesn't mean it shouldn't happen. He turned to address the creature directly. Have you given any thought to what you'd like to do now? You're free to make your own choices for the first time in years. That's both exciting and probably a little overwhelming. The response was immediate and complex, a series of vocalizations that conveyed desire for knowledge, exploration, and meaningful interaction with other intelligent beings. The creature had been isolated for so long that its primary goal now seemed to be simply experiencing everything it had been denied. It wants to learn. Dr. Veltar translated unnecessarily. It wants to explore, to understand different cultures and sciences and ways of thinking. This is remarkable. We're witnessing the intellectual awakening of a completely new form of consciousness. Not new, Marcus corrected gently, just finally recognized. The intelligence was always there. It just needed someone to acknowledge it. As they talked, Sarah noticed that the dining area had gradually filled with beings from every corner of the galaxy. Word had spread throughout the station that the human and the Void Stalker could be found here, engaged in open discussions with anyone who wanted to participate. What had started as a simple meal had evolved into an impromptu symposium on consciousness, communication, and the nature of civilized interaction. A young Dalarian student raised her hand tentatively. "If I may ask," she said, directing her question toward the Void Stalker, "what was it like before? When the arrangement was different?" The creature's response was measured and thoughtful. It spoke of isolation, of being treated as an object rather than an individual, of having its natural curiosity and desire for intellectual stimulation suppressed in favor of simple intimidation tactics. But it also acknowledged that the experience had taught it valuable lessons about the difference between fear and respect, between submission and cooperation. "It sounds like you've learned a lot about galactic society, even if you were experiencing it from an unusual perspective," observed a Centaurian philosopher who had been listening intently. "Your insights into power dynamics and social structures could be invaluable to our understanding of interspecies relations." The Void Stalker's response surprised everyone. It expressed interest not just in sharing its observations, but in learning about the theoretical frameworks that academic beings use to understand society and culture. It wanted to be more than just a subject of study. It wanted to be a participant in the intellectual discourse. "This is unprecedented," breathed Dr. Veltar, a completely non-humanoid intelligence requesting access to advanced philosophical and sociological education. "We'll need to completely rethink our pedagogical approaches." Marcus smiled at the academic's excitement. "Or maybe you just need to treat learning as a conversation rather than a lecture. Seems to work pretty well for us." As if to demonstrate his point, the Void Stalker began asking questions about the various academic disciplines represented by the beings present. Its inquiries were sophisticated and insightful, revealing a mind that had been absorbing and analyzing information for years, while having no outlet for intellectual expression. "You know," said Captain Morvex thoughtfully, "there's something else to consider here. If one supposedly mindless creature turns out to be this intelligent, how many others are we misunderstanding? How many potential allies, friends, and colleagues are we dismissing because they don't fit our preconceptions about what intelligence looks like?" The question hung in the air, challenging everyone present to reconsider their assumptions about the beings they encountered in their daily lives. Sarah found herself thinking about her own experiences as a trader, wondering how many opportunities for meaningful connection she had missed because she had been too quick to judge based on appearances or reputation. 3 months after the incident at the trading station, Sarah found herself returning to the same orbital platform with a cargo hold full of Earth delicacies and a head full of questions. The galaxy had changed in ways both subtle and profound since that day when a young human had refused to be intimidated by a Kralith, warlord and his supposedly fearsome pet. The changes were visible from the moment she docked. The trading station had been expanded significantly, with new research facilities and cultural exchange centers that hadn't existed during her last visit. A massive new docking bay accommodated ships from species that had rarely ventured into this region of space before. Most remarkably, the old atmosphere of suspicion and barely contained violence had been replaced by something approaching genuine cooperation. As Sarah made her way through the corridors, she passed discussion groups where beings from radically different species engaged in animated conversations about philosophy, science and art. Translation: devices had been upgraded to handle increasingly complex concepts as beings discovered that meaningful communication was possible even across vast biological and cultural differences. She found Marcus in what had once been a simple observation deck but was now called the Consciousness Studies Center. He was engaged in what appeared to be a 3-way philosophical debate with a Rigelian mathematician and his Void Stalker companion, who had acquired the name Thoughtful through a democratic process involving the entire station population. "Sarah," Marcus called out when he spotted her. "Perfect timing. We were just discussing whether mathematical concepts exist independently of consciousness or are created by it. Thoughtful has some fascinating perspectives on the relationship between abstract thinking and physical reality. The creature that had once been Thektar's weapon of intimidation now wore what could only be described as professional academic accessories, a translator device specifically calibrated to its unique vocal range, and a datapad modified for manipulation by claws rather than fingers. It greeted Sarah with a complex vocalization that her updated implant translated as a warm welcome, tinged with curiosity about her recent travels. "It's incredible," Sarah said, settling into the conversation area. "The last time I was here, everyone was terrified of Thoughtful. Now it looks like half the galaxy's academic community has relocated here just to participate in these discussions." "Not quite half," Marcus laughed, "but we've had some interesting developments. The Galactic Academy has established a permanent research partnership with the station. 3 new species have made first contact in the last month specifically because they heard about the breakthrough in interspecies communication happening here, and Thoughtful has been accepted into the doctoral program at the Institute for Advanced Consciousness Studies." Thoughtful rumbled something that Sarah's implant translated as modest pride mixed with excitement about future learning opportunities. The creature had apparently discovered a passion for theoretical xenopsychology and was eager to contribute to the growing body of research on non-traditional intelligence. "What about Thektar?" Sarah asked. "I heard rumors that he tried to file legal claims for theft of property." Marcus's expression darkened slightly. "He did try, but that didn't go well for him. It turns out that when you build your entire business model on the illegal ownership of sapient beings, you don't have much legal ground to stand on. The Commerce Union's investigation revealed that he'd been trafficking in several questionable companion creatures over the years. The broader implications have been significant," added Dr. Veltar, who had apparently made herself a permanent fixture at the station. "The Dignity Accords have been updated to include explicit protections for all demonstrably sapient beings, regardless of their physical form or origin. It's the most significant expansion of individual rights in galactic law since the founding of the Commerce Union." Thoughtful made a sound that conveyed satisfaction mixed with sadness. It was pleased about the legal changes but regretful that it had taken so long for the galaxy to recognize what should have been obvious about the rights of thinking beings. "The really interesting development," Marcus continued, "is what's happening with other species. Once word spread that intelligence could take forms that nobody had previously recognized, research teams started taking second looks at creatures that had been dismissed as non-sapient. The discoveries have been remarkable. As if summoned by the conversation, a new group approached their discussion area. Sarah was surprised to see that it included several beings she didn't recognize, creatures that moved and communicated in ways that suggested intelligence but didn't fit any of the traditional patterns of galactic civilization. "Allow me to introduce some of our newest participants," Dr. Veltar said with obvious excitement. "These are representatives from the Crystalline Collective, silicon-based beings whose thought processes operate on completely different timescales than carbon-based life. We've been developing communication protocols that allow for meaningful exchange, despite the fact that their basic cognitive cycles are measured in hours rather than seconds. One of the crystalline beings, its faceted surface refracting the station's lighting into spectacular patterns, produced a series of harmonic tones that took several minutes to complete. When the translation finally appeared on Sarah's display, it was a greeting that contained layers of meaning about the joy of discovering new forms of consciousness and the mathematical beauty of cross-species understanding. And over there, Marcus pointed to another group. "We have delegates from the hive mind synthesis. They're exploring whether individual consciousness can meaningfully interact with distributed intelligence networks. The philosophical implications alone are keeping half the ethics departments in the galaxy busy." Sarah watched in amazement as beings that would have been considered impossibly alien just months ago engaged in sophisticated discussions about the nature of existence, consciousness, and meaning. The breakthrough that had started with one human refusing to be intimidated had sparked a revolution in how the galaxy understood intelligence itself. "You know," she said to Marcus, "when I first saw you standing up to Thektar, I thought you were either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid. Now I'm starting to think you might have been incredibly wise. Marcus shrugged in the self-deprecating way that had become familiar to everyone on the station. I just treated another thinking being with basic respect. If that counts as wisdom, then maybe the bar for wisdom was set too low. Thoughtful rumbled something that Sarah's implant couldn't quite translate, but Marcus apparently understood. Thoughtful points out that wisdom isn't about having profound insights, he explained. It's about having the courage to act on simple truths that everyone else is too comfortable to acknowledge. As Sarah looked around at the bustling center of interspecies learning and cooperation that had grown up around their friendship, she had to admit that there was something profound in that simple observation. Sometimes the most revolutionary act was simply refusing to accept that things had to be the way they had always been. The dying star outside the observation windows continued its ancient dance of destruction and renewal, but inside the station, something entirely new was being born. A form of galactic civilization based not on fear and assumptions, but on the radical idea that every thinking being deserved to be understood on their own terms. And at the center of it all was a young human who had simply refused to be afraid, and a creature who had finally found someone willing to listen. Together, they had shown the galaxy that intelligence, dignity, and friendship could take forms that no one had previously imagined possible.